Hey guys, tonight we are climbing straight into the mysterious bed of Henry VIII, a king with so many wives you'd need a calculator just to remember their names. But don't be fooled into expecting a romantic story. This is a journey through obsession, dried bloodstains on wedding sheets, and the times Henry tore an entire religion apart just to get back into bed with another woman. You know what? In Tudor times, the wedding night wasn't a place for love whispers. It was basically a national inspection. If there was no blood on the sheets, you weren't a bride, you were a suspect. And if you happened to be one of Henry's wives, surviving the first night was just level 1. Level 2, give birth to a son. Level 3, try not to get beheaded. And the funniest part? The entire court would wait outside your bedchamber, listening closely, praying for divine approval of your bedroom performance. Imagine 50 people camping outside your door, hanging on every moan and whisper. Sounds like a dark comedy, doesn't it? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. There's nothing I enjoy more than telling you stories of beheadings and Tudor bedroom disasters while you're wrapped up in a blanket wondering, wow, my life is actually pretty safe, huh? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Tonight, we enter the Tudor bedchamber, a place where intimacy was another word for nightmare. Forget every romantic scene you've ever seen in films. In Tudor England, you'd barely survive a single night in the bedroom. Picture this. You've just been married. And if you're a royal bride marrying none other than King Henry VIII, the most private moment of your life will become a public spectacle. Your wedding bed isn't a sanctuary, it's a stage. The courtiers lead you to the chamber. They make crude jokes, laugh amongst themselves, and undress you as if you're in a farce rather than a royal ritual. You're placed beneath the sheets, and then King Henry is escorted in by his own entourage, also laughing, also eager to watch the show. A bishop is present too, ready to bless the union one more time. Not in a church, but right there in your nightgown, in front of 50 grinning faces. And when the act is done, they rush in, pull back the sheets, and inspect the linen for blood. Virgin blood. Because in Tudor England, your maidenhead isn't just a part of your body, it's a matter of national security. No blood means no honor. No honor leads to annulment, accusations of witchcraft, or simply being labeled a harlot within 12 hours of becoming a wife. Now slide down the social ladder. Imagine you're the daughter of a wealthy merchant. Your wedding night isn't quite a theatre show, but it's still a community event. Your mother, aunts, and cousins crowd around you beforehand, whispering advice that boils down to one chilling sentence. Lie still and think of God. Meanwhile, your new husband's male relatives are downstairs, filling his head with horror stories of wives who died in childbirth. Your bedchamber is located above the shop. Just a thin cloth curtain separates your most intimate moments from the rest of the household. Every whispered word, every hushed gasp, every nervous sound they all carry through the night. And yes, they are listening. Now let's go even lower to the peasant bride. There's no privacy, no walls. You share a single room with your husband's entire family, brothers, sisters, and perhaps a cow or two, depending on the season. The bed, if you can call it that, is a straw pile that hasn't been changed since the last outbreak of plague rolled through town. The blankets are coarse. The air is thick with the smell of sweat, manure, and damp earth. Your husband has never bathed, neither have you. The smell is biblical. He's drunk on weak ale because the water is unsafe. His hands are rough from ploughing fields, and he's clumsy and afraid. You're terrified. No one has explained what's about to happen. All you know is this. Your mother died in childbirth when you were 12, and the village wise woman only laughed when you asked about marriage. Beneath all of this lies a single truth, one that unites queens, merchants' daughters, and peasant brides alike. Your wedding night in Tudor England isn't a celebration of love. It's a test of endurance. Sex isn't about pleasure. It's about duty. Duty to produce heirs. Duty to secure alliances. Duty to satisfy church expectations. Love, compatibility, sexual enjoyment. These are modern fantasies. In the 16th century, your body does not belong to you. It belongs to your husband. It belongs to the church. It belongs to the state. And if you were unlucky enough to marry Henry VIII himself, it might also belong to the executioner's block. Catherine of Aragon learned this truth the hardest way. Anne Boleyn learned it faster. Jane Seymour died in service of it. In the Tudor world, the woman's body was the battleground on which kingdoms rose and fell. And on your wedding night, whether you sleep on silk or straw, one thing is certain: romance is dead. And everyone gets to watch it happen. Now, let's meet Catherine of Aragon, wife number 1, in the tragic parade that was Henry VIII's love life. Catherine was born a Spanish princess, shaped by deep Catholic devotion and the heavy armour of royal duty. At 15 years old, she was sent to England, unable to speak the language, but carrying an enormous dowry and the weight of international expectation. Her first husband was not Henry, but his older brother, Arthur. They were married in the year 1501, and on their wedding night, half the court stood by and watched as if 2 trembling teenagers were some kind of entertainment. Arthur was pale, frail, and seemed more interested in scripture than in consummation. Within 5 months, they were sent to Wales, and then Arthur died, leaving Catherine a widow at barely 16. But that's where a question began, a whisper that would echo for more than 2 decades. Did they consummate the marriage? Catherine swore on her deathbed that they did not. Arthur, she claimed, was far too weak, too sickly to fulfill his husbandly duty. What sounded like bedroom gossip would later become a theological minefield, one that would shake the English throne to its core. Fast forward to 1509. Henry VIII ascends the throne at age 18, tall, athletic, bursting with charm, and absolutely convinced he is God's gift to women. And what does he do? He marries his dead brother's widow. Catherine, now 23, was practically considered a spinster by Tudor standards. But she was intelligent, well-bred, and most importantly, her marriage brought England a valuable alliance with Spain. Their early years seemed almost golden. Henry was infatuated, Catherine was grateful, and the kingdom anxiously awaited the birth of a male heir. Catherine conceived quickly, then miscarried. She conceived again, another loss, again, and again. Between 1510 and 1518, Catherine endured at least 6 pregnancies. Most ended in miscarriage before the 3rd month. A few resulted in stillbirths or infants who died within weeks. The only child to survive was Mary, born in 1516, a daughter. Every missed period became a national holiday. Every sudden bleeding became a national disaster. Catherine's value as a woman, wife, and queen was reduced to one role: produce a son. Sex with Henry was not an expression of love. It was a ritual of survival for the dynasty. The church preached that anything beyond the basic act of procreation was sinful. Catherine, raised to believe that sex was something women endured, not enjoyed, complied. She would lie still, close her eyes, pray to the Virgin Mary for a son. Meanwhile, Henry performed his duty not as a lover, but as a king, under divine pressure. No time for foreplay, no tenderness. Just a mechanical attempt at immortality through reproduction. Every encounter carried the weight of the kingdom's future, yet produced only grief. By her 30s, Catherine's body was exhausted. Her periods became irregular. Was it pregnancy or failure? Every delayed cycle sent the court into speculation. Every return of blood was met with silent despair. By 1525, Catherine was 39 years old, a veteran of endless pregnancies and silent heartbreak. And Henry's eyes had begun to wander. A younger woman was rising at court, a woman who refused to sleep with him unless he made her queen. That woman would change England forever. But for now, Catherine remained dignified, devout, and tragically marked by a womb that couldn't produce what the world demanded. Her marriage bed had become a battlefield. And though Catherine would not lose her head like some of those who followed her, she would lose her crown, her husband, and her place in a country she once ruled with grace. Her sin in Henry's eyes was not infidelity, not betrayal. It was something far worse in Tudor England. She had failed to give him a son. Mary's birth was a miracle, but the wrong kind. In Tudor England, daughters didn't count. They were walking dowries, expensive to raise, and destined to become someone else's property. Henry needed a son, and Catherine had failed to give him one. Once she reached her 30s, Catherine's menstrual cycles became irregular. Every late period sent whispers fluttering through the palace, maybe this time, only to be followed by disappointment when blood returned. Each visit from Henry to her bedchamber became less frequent, colder, more perfunctory. From Catherine's perspective, raised in the iron grip of Catholic doctrine, she was still Henry's lawful wife, bound by God and Church. Marriage was a sacrament, not a contract to be broken when inconvenient. But from the vantage point of a Tudor king obsessively pursuing a male heir, Henry's thoughts turned elsewhere. Catherine's bedroom was no longer just a place of forced intimacy. It became a battlefield of theology and politics. Catherine insisted that marriage was eternal. Henry began searching for a path out, and somewhere behind the tapestry screens, the woman who would replace her was already waiting. Her name was Anne Boleyn, England's own Black Rose, with thorns sharp enough to tear the church in half. Anne was nothing like Catherine. She wasn't a foreign-born princess raised on piety. She didn't cross the channel with trunks of etiquette and dowry gold. Anne had been polished in the French court, a finishing school for charm, seduction, and psychological warfare. While Catherine was taught that sex was a duty to be endured, Anne learned that sexuality was a weapon one best kept sheathed, until its wielder wanted blood. When she returned to England around the year 1522, Anne was no mere court ornament. She could discuss scripture and fashion in the same breath. She had the wit to intrigue, the elegance to mesmerize, and the audacity to say no. By 1526, Henry noticed her. She was young, she was sharp, and she was English, unlike Catherine, who remained forever foreign in the eyes of many courtiers. More importantly, Anne refused to become a mistress. She had learned from her sister Mary's downfall. Mary Boleyn had been Henry's lover, bore him at least one child, and ended up discarded when he grew bored. Anne would not be next in that line. If Henry wanted her, he would have to tear down the world to get her, and he almost did. A delicate yet ruthless game began. Anne allowed Henry to flirt. She accepted his love letters, some of them so explicit they bordered on divine blasphemy. She let him touch, within limits but never enough to claim her. She knew the king. She knew that power lay not in surrender but in denial. If she ever let him have what he wanted too soon, she would be forgotten within months. Another shadow in the Queen's corridor. Henry, accustomed to taking what he wanted, became obsessed. At first it was lust, then it became fixation. Soon it evolved into political revolution. Henry decided that in order to have Anne, he would have to invalidate his marriage to Catherine, a marriage blessed by God and Rome. But theology is not easily bent, not even by a king. Henry claimed that his marriage to Catherine was cursed because she had been his brother's wife. He cited scripture, twisted doctrine, and leaned into every whispered doubt surrounding their union. If Catherine's marriage to Arthur had been consummated, then her marriage to Henry was invalid in the eyes of God. That was Henry's argument. Catherine, dignified even then, swore it had not been consummated. For Catherine, this was no longer about childbirth. It was about survival, spiritual, political, personal. But the truth no longer mattered. Anne's presence at court grew louder. Her influence seeped through letters, gifts, and every tense breath Henry took at night. By 1529, Henry wanted more than just Anne's attention. He wanted freedom. Freedom to marry again. Freedom to produce a legitimate son. Freedom from Catherine. Anne would not sleep with him. Not yet. Not until he ripped down the church, rewrote the law, and put a crown on her head. And so the King of England set his eyes on Rome and prepared to break it, all for a woman who hadn't even let him past her skirts. For 6 long years, Henry and Anne lived in a nearly chaste relationship, a courtship that looked pure in the bedroom, yet explosive everywhere else. Henry wrote her passionate love letters, some bordering on indecent, while he manoeuvred through a labyrinth of church law to pursue an annulment from Catherine. Anne, for her part, was not just relying on beauty. She became Henry's intellectual accomplice, discussing theology, suggesting political strategy, and introducing Protestant ideas that conveniently supported the king's desire to declare his marriage invalid. But this game of seduction came with a terrible cost. The court called her a home-wrecking witch, a shameless adulteress. The reason the king had turned from Rome, Anne Boleyn's reputation was ripped to shreds until even her name drew whispers of scandal. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, Catherine's nephew threatened war if Henry dared to abandon his aunt. Diplomats wrote home about the scandalous woman, while priests denounced her from pulpits as the devil's muse. By the year 1532, Anne was 25 years old, practically a spinster by Tudor standards, and still unmarried. Meanwhile, Henry had risked everything. Broken with Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, plunged the nation into religious turmoil, all for a woman he had never slept with. Yet Anne held firm. She would not give herself until Henry made her his lawful queen. It was daring, audacious, and it nearly worked. But eventually, she cracked. Late in the year 1532, Anne and Henry finally slept together, and almost immediately she became pregnant. The clock started ticking. If she was ever going to become queen, it had to be now. They married in secret in January of 1533, with Anne already showing. A rushed coronation followed. Many nobles refused to attend, the people muttered. The courts of Europe wrote this was England's great shame. And then, in September of that same year, the child was born. Princess Elizabeth. Henry tried to appear gracious, even claimed he loved the child. But disappointment radiated from every word he spoke. Anne had wagered everything, her reputation, her safety, the entire religious structure of England on her ability to produce a male heir. And in her first throw of the dice, she rolled a girl. The spell was broken. From that moment, everything changed. Anne was no longer the unattainable mistress, she was a wife. A wife expected to produce a son. A wife who could be judged, complained about, replaced. Henry grew restless. Anne became pregnant again, and miscarried. Then again, another loss. One pregnancy in 1536 may have been a male fetus lost after a stressful argument or one of Henry's accidents. Each miscarriage wore her down. Each failure drew the king further away. Desperation crept into Anne's voice, and Henry began referring to her as that cursed woman. The same fiery wit and sharp tongue that once captivated him now irritated him. Every clever remark now sounded like nagging. Every argument reminded him that she was no longer the prize, she was the problem. And above all, she was failing to do the one thing she was brought into his bed for. Give him a son. In Henry's mind, that was not just a disappointment, it was treason. Her seduction had conquered a king, a church, and a country. But childbirth would conquer her, and Henry was already looking for a way out. By the year 1536, Henry's eyes had already begun to drift towards someone new. Jane Seymour, soft-spoken, gentle, and wrapped in the quiet promise of obedience. Where Anne was fire, Jane was fog. Where Anne sparred and debated, Jane bowed her head and murmured prayers. She was everything Anne was not. Modestly dressed, carefully polite, and perfectly unthreatening. To a king whose temper had grown heavy with age and disappointment, Jane was no longer just a lady in waiting. She was an escape route. Anne Boleyn, once the spark that set England's religious revolution ablaze, was now seen as noise. She had once taught Henry what it meant to crave, now he craved silence. He no longer desired a woman who challenged him with ideas. He wanted a wife who agreed, who glowed quietly, who delivered a son, and then retreated into dutiful invisibility. Jane more than fit the mold. From the moment Henry's gaze settled on Jane, Anne's days were numbered. It happened fast, almost brutally so. 1 minute Anne was Queen of England, mother of the royal princess, the woman for whom Henry had broken with centuries of religious authority, and the next, she was a liability. Miscarriages had worn thin Henry's patience. Rumours lingered. Rebellion simmered in Catholic corners, and Jane, so still, so pure-looking, stood nearby, hand folded over hand, offering to be everything Anne was not. Then came the charges. Adultery, incest, treason. Even by Tudor standards, it was ludicrous. Anne was accused of sleeping with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. Forensic historians today agree the claims were fabricated. But that didn't matter. In Tudor England, a woman's innocence was measured not by truth but by her king's convenience. Anne's trial was a performance. Her silence would have been seen as guilt. Her protests were dismissed as hysteria. In May of 1536, witnesses were produced, some coerced, others bribed. The verdict was foregone. And so, on the 19th day of May, in the year 1536, Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold. Not to the axe Henry had granted her the mercy of a French swordsman. She wore a grey gown. She held her head high. She knelt before the blade. Her last words spoke of God and her king. Not one complaint, not one accusation. Then, with a single, swift stroke of a sword, the woman who had turned England upside down was gone. She did not die because of what she did in the bedroom. She died because she forgot a simple, unwritten Tudor rule. A woman's power was always borrowed, and borrowed power must, in time, be returned often in blood. While Anne's head fell on Tower Green, another silent tragedy rippled across the kingdom, countless smaller versions of Anne's story. Far from the glittering court, in noble houses and rustic estates, women were living their own private executions. You were 16, a duke's daughter, married off to a man old enough to be your grandfather, a man with 2 dead wives buried behind the chapel. On your wedding night, drunk men tear at your clothes, laughing. In the morning, servants inspect the sheets as if reading a horoscope in blood. Or you were 19, a baron's niece, forced into an alliance sealed not by love but by livestock. Your husband touches you once a month, not out of desire, but because his family demands an heir. Or maybe you were simply a wife, whose body was the seat of some fragile political bargain. A womb with a title, a spine bent under obligation. Across every class, the story remained the same. If you were a woman in Tudor England, your body was not your own. It was leverage. It was a vessel. It was evidence. A battlefield. A dowry in flesh. A treaty wrapped in skin. Very rarely was it home. Anne Boleyn learned that truth at the scaffold. Countless others learned it alone, in linen sheets stained with prayer, in the shadow of marital beds built not for tenderness, but for duty. And standing just behind Anne's corpse, wearing sorrow like a borrowed cloak, was a woman who understood the rules perfectly. Jane Seymour. She would give the king what he needed, but she would not walk away unscarred. If Anne Boleyn was the lightning bolt that split the Tudor sky, then Jane Seymour was the soft rain that followed so quiet, you might not notice the tragedy gathering beneath her calm surface. Jane didn't have Anne's sophistication, nor Catherine's royal pedigree, but Jane had something Henry craved after years of chaos and disappointment: quiet obedience. She served Catherine of Aragon, then she served Anne Boleyn. Jane had been in the background for years, watching 2 queens fall from unimaginable heights, each consumed by the same fires that once crowned them. And in that silent observation, Jane learned something crucial. Women did not survive the Tudor court by fighting. They survived by bending gently, strategically, just before the blade fell. By the year 1535, Henry began to notice Jane. She did not resist. She did not play hard to get. She did not tease or intrigue. Instead, she offered Henry exactly what he thought God demanded: humility, soft eyes, folded hands, faint smiles, and whispered prayers. There were no love letters scattered with phrases of longing, no theological debates, no sexual tension built through strategic denial. Jane simply made Henry feel righteous again, like the world, after all its noise and conflict, had finally delivered him a woman who understood her role. When Anne Boleyn was executed on the 19th day of May in the year 1536, Jane Seymour was betrothed to Henry the very next day. 10 days later, just long enough for the Tower of London to wash the blood from its stones, they were married. There was no grand coronation, no golden barges on the Thames, no cheering crowds swelling with hope. Jane became queen in a hush, as if England, bruised and breathless, barely knew how to react. And Jane's first and only act as queen was the one that mattered most. She became pregnant. Nothing else was required of her. She knew this. She did not press for religious reforms. She did not charm foreign ambassadors. She did not demand a coronation of her own. She was content to be a living vessel, a silent porcelain chalice beneath the altar of Henry's desperate hope. The kingdom fell into a suspenseful quiet as her pregnancy progressed. This was Henry's 3rd queen, his 3rd gamble, his last, most fragile strand of faith in divine favour. When Jane went into labour in the month of October in the year 1537, the entire country seemed to hold its breath. It lasted 3 days, 3 long, excruciating days. And then, on the 12th day of October, Jane Seymour gave birth to Edward. The male heir Henry had been seeking for nearly 3 decades. The bells rang across England. The streets erupted in celebration. Henry wept with relief. Finally, he had his son. Jane was declared the perfect queen, the one who had succeeded where Catherine and Anne had failed. And then, fewer than 14 days later, she died. The cause: puerperal fever, childbed infection, a common killer of Tudor mothers. The perfect queen faded from life before she ever had the chance to disappoint her king. Henry genuinely mourned her, more deeply perhaps than any of his other wives. Maybe it was because she gave him Edward. Maybe it was because she never lived long enough to argue, or age, or make demands. Maybe it was just easier to love a woman who stands forever in memory, frozen at her most useful moment. Jane Seymour became the ideal. The silent wife who obeyed, conceived, delivered, and died. She was buried with honour at Windsor Castle, and when Henry died a decade later, he demanded to be laid beside her, not beside the women who challenged him, changed him, or died for disappointing him. Jane had given him what he wanted, a son, and more importantly, she had taken nothing more. After Jane's death, Henry was forced to look up from his grief and face the same cold political truth. He still needed a wife. But this time it wasn't for love, lust, or even heirs. It was for survival. England, now a Protestant island severed from Rome, was surrounded by Catholic giants, chiefly Spain and France. Advisors whispered of war. The king needed an ally. And so, a plan emerged. Marry a German princess. Unite with Protestant power. Write a treaty with wedding vows. Enter Anne of Cleves, or Anna von Cleve, known to history largely through a single portrait. Painted by Hans Holbein the Younger, this portrait was not just art. It was strategic diplomacy. The Anne in that painting was gentle, composed, with delicate features and refined grace, the visual embodiment of Protestant elegance. But paintings are liars. When Henry met Anne in person in January of 1540, the result was nothing short of farcical tragedy. Henry, always a fan of romance theatre, decided to surprise his bride. Disguised as a humble courtier, he burst into Anne's chambers expecting a swooning reaction, the kind where she would see through the disguise and fall into his arms, like a scene from a medieval love poem. Instead, Anne barely looked at him. She responded politely formally as one does when a stranger barges into their room unannounced. Anne did not know this man was the king, and Henry, whose ego had never encountered such indifference, was humiliated. In his mind, every woman in any context should recognize and desire him, even behind a costume. From that moment, he loathed her. But politics demanded obedience. So on the 6th day of January, in the year 1540, Henry married Anne of Cleves, though he was already plotting an exit. The wedding night was catastrophic. Henry complained that he could not perform his duty. He later claimed Anne was so unattractive that his body simply refused to cooperate. Courtiers whispered about her being ungainly, smelling poorly, lacking charm. But let's remember, Henry was 49 years old, morbidly obese, and suffering from a festering leg wound that oozed pus and stench. It is entirely possible the problem did not lie with Anne. The marriage was never consummated. For 6 months, Anne was queen in name alone, a political ghost drifting through court halls. Henry avoided her. Jane Seymour's unused jewellery was left untouched in chests, as if even the royal jewels refused to adorn her. Finally, having failed in every intimate sense, Henry sought an annulment. His grounds? Non-consummation. Here, Anne's wisdom shone. She did not protest, she did not plead, she did not demand justice or cling to a crown never truly hers. She agreed immediately. In return, she was rewarded handsomely. Anne received generous estates, an annual income of £800, the equivalent of great wealth, even for a noblewoman, and the honorary title of the King's beloved sister. She was given Hever Castle, former home of the Boleyn family, and Richmond Palace as her personal residences. She remained on friendly terms with Henry, even visiting court occasionally and greeting his later wives with cordial distance. Anne outlived Henry and 3 of his subsequent wives. She was the only queen to leave that marriage richer, safer, and alive. History remembers Anne of Cleves not for passion nor turmoil, but for something far more valuable in Tudor England: clever surrender. She understood that survival sometimes meant stepping back, folding the hand, and smiling as you walked away with your life and a castle. One might say Anne didn't lose the Tudor marriage lottery at all. She cashed out early and won. Catherine Howard, in every sense, was a living reminder that in a society obsessed with female purity, your past could become the axe at your throat. Catherine came from the Howard family, powerful in name, but impoverished in reality. She grew up in the household of her grandmother, the Dowager Duchess of Norfolk, a place far too lax in supervision and far too crowded with teenage hormones. Catherine began loving early first with her music tutor, Henry Mannix, when she was around 13. Then with a young man named Francis Dereham. These things seemed trivial, unremarkable, until the day she caught the king's eye. When Catherine entered court as lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, Henry noticed her immediately. She was about 17 years old then, radiant, lively, and everything his fourth wife was not. In July of 1540, Henry divorced Anne. By the end of that same month, he married Catherine Howard. The girl who just months earlier was passing love notes in a duchess's estate now wore the crown of England. But Catherine was stepping into a velvet-lined cage. Henry, now nearly 50 years old, was obese and suffering from chronic leg ulcers that oozed pus and made him irritable and immobile. Catherine was young, fertile, and bursting with a vibrant hunger for life, or perhaps simply for affection. That hunger had not disappeared when she wore the crown. It followed her. Her past followed too. While Catherine danced at court and charmed the king with her youthful laughter, a web of secrets was tightening around her. Francis Dereham was appointed to her household, perhaps at her request, and that was mistake number one. Mistake number two was Thomas Culpeper, a handsome courtier with access to the king's private chambers. Catherine and Culpeper exchanged letters. They met in secret. Perhaps they never consummated the affair. But in Tudor England, letters were crimes, intimacy was treason, and even the implied betrayal of a queen could be treated as a national emergency. Then, someone talked. In November of 1541, Archbishop Thomas Cranmer received an anonymous letter detailing Catherine's premarital indiscretions. Henry was informed. At first he refused to believe it, but the evidence kept piling up and eventually Catherine's past became weaponized. This time, Henry didn't need theological loopholes, foreign threats, or staged trials. He changed the law. A new act was passed in Parliament. Any woman who married the king while concealing a prior sexual history would be guilty of treason. A retroactive death sentence. Catherine was arrested. Francis Dereham confessed under torture. Thomas Culpeper admitted to intending adultery. Catherine was stripped of her title and sent to Sion Abbey to await her fate. It was said she asked for the execution block the night before her death to practice laying her head upon it, like a child trying to sleep in a strange bed. On the 13th day of February in the year 1542, Catherine Howard was executed at the Tower of London. She was around 21 years old. They say her last words were, "I die a queen, but I would rather have died the wife of Culpeper." But whether she spoke them or not, her death symbolizes something greater. Catherine did not die because she betrayed a king. She died because she loved too soon, and in ways that Tudor society could not forgive. She lived in a world where women were required to be two impossible things at once: pure as a child, desirable as a woman. Fall short on either side and the blade was waiting. Henry's sixth and final wife, Catherine Parr, stands apart not because she was cherished or feared, but because she outlived him. Not by chance, but by intelligence, restraint, and a rare emotional finesse. Catherine was not young. She was 31 when she married Henry in the year 1543, practically ancient by Tudor standards, and she had already buried two husbands. She did not arrive at court to seduce or flutter. She arrived to survive, to stabilize, to quietly outthink a king who had already killed or discarded 5 women before her. By this point, Henry was deteriorating physically and psychologically. His leg, once wounded in a jousting accident years before, had turned into a festering ulcer oozing pus and stench. He was morbidly obese. His mood swayed between manic charm and volcanic rage. The royal bedchamber was no longer a place of physical passion, but a chamber of political tension, paranoia, and pain. Catherine Parr chose her role wisely. Not as lover, not as sexual temptation, but as an intellectual companion. She spoke to Henry about theology, about history, about the Reformation sweeping across Europe. Not as a challenger like Anne Boleyn once did, but as a student, always with gentle questions, posed as if she sought the king's superior wisdom. Henry, massively insecure yet deeply proud, thrived in this dynamic. Catherine crafted her every word to make him feel like a philosopher king, a moral guide, a God-chosen ruler defending England from corruption. She was Anne Boleyn without the rebellion, Jane Seymour without the silence. She saw him clearly and made sure he never felt exposed. Catherine inherited not just a diseased husband, but his fractured household. 3 children, Mary, Elizabeth and Edward, had grown up in political shadows, alternately declared bastards or heirs depending on the king's mood. Catherine would become the first stepmother in Tudor history to unite all 3 under one roof. She tutored Elizabeth in languages, oversaw Mary's religious education, and ensured Edward had intermittent moments of normalcy. For the first time in decades, Henry's legitimate children lived together under the same maternal hand. But Catherine's intellect was not without risk. She supported the Protestant Reformation. Quietly at first in writing, in discussion circles, in personal devotion. She even penned a book, Prayers or Meditations, published in 1545 under her own name, the first English queen ever to publish a book in her lifetime. But even cleverness can go too far in a paranoid court. Conservative factions began whispering that Catherine was a secret Lutheran, that she sought to twist the king's mind against the Church of England. In the summer of 1546, evidence mounted, accusations flew, an arrest warrant was drawn up. Catherine's execution seemed imminent, but here lies her genius. With word of the warrant, Catherine approached Henry in their garden. In a soft voice, she apologized not for her beliefs, but for her audacity. She claimed she never wished to debate him, only to learn from him. She praised his divine wisdom. She told him she was grateful to be guided by such a holy intellect. Henry, flattered beyond reason, tore up the arrest order that very night. Catherine Parr survived the king. On the 28th day of January, in the year 1547, Henry died. Catherine was finally free. She remarried Thomas Seymour, the ambitious and dangerously charming brother of Jane Seymour, whom she had loved before being drawn into Henry's orbit. But her happiness did not last. She became pregnant at nearly 36, an age that carried enormous risk in Tudor times. On the 5th day of September 1548, she died due to complications from childbirth. Her daughter, Mary Seymour, disappeared from history not long after. Despite her tragic end, Catherine Parr remains singular in Tudor history. She was the only queen to write and publish under her own name, the only one to leave Henry's throne with her body intact and her reputation mostly unscathed. She mapped the narrowest path between danger and blindness, between intellect and submission, and she left behind this truth. In a world where women are tools, the one who hears which silence will save her and which word will doom her is the one who lives just long enough to outlast the system that never loved her. While the royal court changed wives as easily as changing gowns, the common people of Tudor England were waging a different kind of war, a bedroom war, in which intimacy wasn't about pleasure or even power, but survival. Picture this. You're a 22-year-old peasant woman. You live in a one-room cottage with walls of wattle and daub, a thatched roof that leaks when it rains, and livestock sleeping by the fire at night for warmth. You marry Thomas, a farm labourer, not for love, but because your families need each other to stay alive. Rent must be paid. Fields must be tilled. No one can afford to stay single. Your wedding night is not a private moment under soft candlelight. There is no lace, no hushed giggles, no promise of romance. Instead, it is a ritual watched, commented on, approved. Your new husband's parents sit near the straw-stuffed mattress, whispering instructions. The door is not locked. Privacy is not a concept. Even the chickens in the corner seem to stare. Sex in your world is quick, silent, often painful. It happens in total darkness or beneath rough blankets, not out of shyness but because the rest of the household is there, listening, breathing in rhythm with you, eyes closed, but ears alert. There are no seductive whispers here, only the heavy breath of your husband, the smell of sweat mixed with damp hay, and the choking scent of animal dung. Your husband doesn't bathe. You don't either. Not because you're unclean, but because water is cold and fuel is precious. Your hair is braided to hide the grease. Your body aches from working fields or carrying water. But none of that matters. You must get pregnant. Children are your security system. Every child you bear is another pair of hands to help on the farm. Another person to feed the fire. Another human shield against starvation when you grow old. If you don't conceive within a year, your mother-in-law will whisper of curses, herbs, fault. Every late period is a sign of hope. Every sudden bleeding is a public tragedy. No one gives you time to grieve. There are peasant remedies for birth control, certain poisons, herbs, moon, soaked water. A few women drink them. Fewer survive. If anyone catches you trying these, you're not just reckless, you're a witch. And witches hang. And then comes childbirth, the real battlefield. There are no doctors, no antiseptics, just the village midwife and a gathering of women who have survived the same ordeal. If things go wrong, they press your hand and pray. If you die, they bury you quietly in the churchyard, and the priest chalks God's will onto your family's grief. There are no portraits of you, no poems, no tombs carved with prayers, just another woman who died in service of life. Meanwhile, in the courts of London, Henry VIII picks and discards queens like a merchant samples silk. But in your world, there is no silk. There is only flesh, duty, and plague. There is no bedroom chess game like Anne Boleyn played, no royal escape like Anne of Cleves managed, and no intellectual shield like Catherine Parr used to survive. Your body is not yours. It belongs to hunger, to the church, to your husband's lineage, to the bored gossip of your neighbours. Across Tudor England, whether you wore a pearl-encrusted crown or a mud-crusted apron, sex was never yours alone. It was labour, obligation, a transaction, a sentence. And if you ever forgot that truth, even for a moment, the world would punish you. Because the most ruthless reality of Henry VIII's time was this: a woman's body was never her home. It was everyone else's battlefield. Behind the bedroom tragedies of Tudor England stood one silent, omnipresent ruler, the Church. In the 16th century, the Church was more than a spiritual guide. It was the moral parent of an entire nation, hovering over every bed and whispering, "Sex is necessary, but the less you enjoy it, the holier you'll be." According to Catholic doctrine of the time, one had roughly 70 days out of 365 in a year where sex was considered acceptable in marriage. The rest? Off limits thanks to Lent, Advent, holy days, feast days, Sundays, and even the simple fact of a woman's monthly cycle. Anything beyond reproductive duty and missionary position, with the man on top and the woman beneath, was labelled sin. A woman on top? Against God's order. Rear entry? Animalistic. Oral intimacy? Unspeakable. Even marital sex that strayed too close to pleasure was considered an offence against heaven. And yet, who enforced these rules? Celibate priests. Men who had never known a woman's body, now policing the sex lives of their entire parish. In confessionals, they demanded details. Women knelt behind wooden screens and described what they had done, and worse, what they had thought. It wasn't uncommon for priests to probe for specifics, sometimes with discomforting curiosity questions we might call voyeuristic today, but back then were justified under the guise of safeguarding morality. In Tudor folklore, people believed women were more lustful than men, and therefore more dangerous. Women weren't allowed to chase pleasure, they were expected to endure. A woman who showed too much passion was suspect, perhaps seduced by the devil, or possessed by demons. If she sought ways to control her fertility, drinking herbal mixtures, wearing amulets, even just spacing pregnancies, she risked being called a witch. And if she tried to end a pregnancy, even for the 10th child, even when childbirth had become a real threat to her life, the act was labelled murder, worse rebellion against God. In this world, only silence earned mercy. Even after Henry VIII broke from Rome in the year 1534 and declared himself the head of a new Church of England, the teachings on sex barely changed. Now the country was both Catholic and Protestant, but neither side offered freedom. Both wanted wives pregnant. Both wanted bodies obedient. not because they loved children, but because children were theology, sovereignty, and national strength. Under both churches, a woman's body was not a temple of the soul, as scripture might suggest. It was a factory, a resource, a weapon, and the command was clear. Sex is a fire. Use it wrong, and burn forever even inside your own marriage bed. Henry VIII died in the year 1547, but his obsessions never truly left England's bedchambers. He died at the age of 55, obese, ulcerated, perhaps diabetic. But the most tragic irony is this: he could no longer feel the pleasure he had brought a nation to its knees to obtain. In his final years, sex and marriage had become hollow performances, political rituals instead of physical experiences. The only woman who gave him a legitimate son was long dead. That son, Edward VI, inherited his throne at 9 years old and died at 15. Henry tore down the Catholic Church, executed friends, banished daughters, and destroyed 2 queens, all in pursuit of a male heir and satisfaction he would never sustain. And in the end, the king died alone, in pain, surrounded by servants who feared him more than loved him. But this story is not just about one king. Everyone in Tudor England was trapped in a similar nightmare, one fueled, more than anything else, by ignorance. Medical ignorance. In the 16th century, no one connected marital sex with disease transmission. No one knew that syphilis, spreading quietly through brothels and noble beds alike, would eat the body alive first with rashes, then insanity, then death. No one understood that repeated miscarriages might come from infection or malnutrition. That postpartum death might be caused by bacteria, invisible killers on unwashed hands and contaminated linens. Instead, they blamed God. If you lost a pregnancy, it was divine judgment. If you died in childbirth, it was fate. Mothers passed this fatalism to daughters, and the horror repeated itself generation after generation. By many historical estimates, 10 to 15% of women in Tudor England died from childbirth or complications related to pregnancy. More than half of all children died before their 5th birthday. To be born at all was a gamble. To reach adulthood, a miracle. Even within the royal court, splendor could not shield them. Jane Seymour died 10 days after delivering the long-awaited prince, likely from puerperal fever. Catherine Parr survived Henry only to die from childbirth herself a year later. The kitchens of palaces were as riddled with germs as any peasant's hut. No one washed hands. Doctors bled patients with knives used moments earlier on animals. Toilets were pits of disease. Perfume hid rot. And still, the church hovered, blessing a system that punished women for their pain, teaching that joy in sex was a sin, that suffering in childbirth was holy, that purity meant silence, and silence kept the ignorant obedient. By the time Henry died, the narrative had twisted itself into something strange. People blamed his downfall on lust, on the sin of taking too many wives, on the moral curse of adultery. But the real curse was older than Henry. It was a system that treated the bedroom like a courtroom where women were tried for the shape of their desire, the color of their bloodied sheets, the number of sons in their arms, where men believed themselves gods behind closed doors, and priests played judge over the size and sweat of married flesh. Sex was not intimacy. Sex was a battlefield, and every wedding night was an ambush. Women entered as brides and risked leaving as corpses. Men believed they controlled their wives, but they were just as trapped, just as terrified of failing their lineage, their god, their king. Because under the Tudors, a bedroom was never just a room. It was a political chamber, a confessional booth, a battlefield between church and crown, and above all, it was a coffin with satin sheets. Henry died on that battlefield, as did countless women unknown to history. But the worst truth is this: the war outlived them. That same logic that a woman's worth is in her womb, that marriage is a legal contract for bodies, that desire is dangerous unless controlled, would linger in England long after the Tudors, long after the crowns had rusted, and long after the kings were gone. This story is not about sex. It's about systems that weaponize it, and the people, from queen to kitchen maid, who bled beneath that sword. The true horror of Tudor England isn't just what happened inside the bedroom. It's how everyone outside agreed to it. The upper classes wielded sex like a political blade. Marriage forged alliances. Virginity was currency. A woman's womb was a battlefield for titles and inheritance. In the middle ranks, merchants, artisans, minor gentry sex became a ladder. If your daughter married upward, you gained status. If your son married a wealthy girl, you acquired land. In the fields and villages, sex was labor. More children meant more hands on the farm, more mouths to feed, yes, but also more bodies to bury your dead. This was not cruelty from a single king. It was a system collective, efficient, and utterly blind to the humanity of women. And for the women who survived childbirth, bleeding and breathless, there was no peace. They were crowned not with jewels but with exhaustion. They became community wombs, giving birth 6, 8, 10 times. Half the children died. Then they began again. A few bruised saints of the body managed to live to 40. Others died nameless in a peasant cot or in a castle chamber, surrounded by embroidered pillows and flies. Whenever someone today says, "People lived healthier back then," they are likely only looking at kings' tombs, not the parish records filled with infants buried before naming day. Tudor society did not protect women. It fed them to its own myths. Myths that the king was ordained by God, that childbirth was sacred suffering, that a woman's sacrifice was the mortar holding up the walls of civilization. There was no word for orgasm, no phrase for emotional connection, no concept of consent. You married like livestock. You bore children like livestock. You were used as needed, then praised or pitied depending on your performance. If you tried to avoid pregnancy, you were a sinner. So, what remains? After all the shimmering silk and blood-soaked sheets of Tudor bedrooms, what do we carry with us besides blurred portraits and echoes of distant screams? Not jewels, not palaces, just a handful of heavy lessons old as empire and still painfully relevant. The first lesson: power cannot buy love nor pleasure. Henry VIII possessed everything a man could desire: a crown, an army, a church obeying his every whim. He bent the scriptures to justify divorces. He used Parliament like a sword. He discarded wives with chilling ease. But in the end he died, not in a lover's embrace but alone, rotting in his own flesh, with a leg wound that stank like death itself. His eyes clouded, his friends silent, his heart heavy with regrets nobody dared name. You can manipulate bodies, but you cannot legislate affection. No decree of state can force fulfillment. The second lesson: sex cannot be a political instrument forever. Treat it like currency, and it becomes counterfeit. Treat it like obligation, and the warmth extinguishes. A body bred only for heirs becomes nothing but a vessel. A woman turned into a contract stops being human. Tudor England tried to turn passion into a machine, and instead broke the very legacy it sought to preserve. Henry's dynasty held power for barely a single generation after his death. Edward was dead by 15. Mary died childless. Elizabeth never Wednesday. The line ended where it began in longing. The third lesson: shame never makes anyone pure. The church taught purity like a weapon. Keep your legs closed or risk damnation. Sex outside marriage? Sinful. Sex inside marriage, if enjoyed too much? Also sinful. Did it stop affair, brothel visits, or syphilis? No, it simply forced it underground. Women whispered their miseries. Men hid their infections. Husbands sought prostitutes when wives failed to conceive, then blamed their wives for barren wombs they had infected. Shame kills intimacy. It does not protect virtue. It makes truth unspoken, and therefore more dangerous. The fourth lesson: patriarchy doesn't just poison women, it blinds men. Henry blamed every failed pregnancy on his wives. He blamed every moment of dissatisfaction on the nearest woman. He cut off heads to solve problems that began inside himself. He never learned to be loved, only feared or obeyed. The men who followed him, even those without crowns, suffered too. They inherited a culture where affection was weakness, tenderness was sin, and vulnerability an impossibility. To dominate others is to be slowly hollowed out from within. Henry left a world filled with children who didn't know how to trust love, fathers who didn't know how to be kind, and sons who inherited his paranoia more than his power. The fifth lesson, the only one that might matter: education is the cure that never came. Not because Henry was exceptionally monstrous, but because no one was allowed to tell him no. No one taught him that a king is not a god. No one taught him that pleasure does not justify cruelty, that faith doesn't require violence, that a woman's body is not a political map. Were Tudor England full of educated, empowered people, people allowed to question, to refuse, to protect their own bodies, this story would have been different. Not bloodless, but perhaps less tragic, perhaps less inevitable, because the nightmare of Tudor beds was never just about sex. It was about what happens when a powerful man, protected by silence and surrounded by fear, is never told the truth. That intimacy without consent is violence. That motherhood without choice is slavery. That marriage without freedom is a prison. And that history, however gilded, is littered with the ghosts of people who were told, "Stay quiet. It's your duty." But whispers always return. And truth, even from the 16th century, continues to thunder like a reminder through time. A king may command bodies, but he never conquers hearts. Behind the horror stories and the blood-stained bed sheets lies a quieter truth, a soft exhale that lingers in the dark like a midnight whisper. And then, at last, they all fell asleep. Catherine, Anne, Jane. Each one wore her own sorrow like a hidden bruise beneath silk and pearls. Their cries were never heard, their pain never held. Beneath the vaulted ceilings of palaces and the thatched roofs of huts, women closed their eyes at night with the same question, "Will I survive the dawn?" Somewhere in the shadows of Hampton Court or Greenwich Palace, a maid carrying a candle might pause at the threshold of a royal bedchamber, the sheets still smelling of fear, hope, or blood. She wonders if a day will ever come when a woman can say no, and not tremble for her life. When saying, "I don't want this," won't sound like a death sentence. When love might be a choice instead of a duty or a weapon. The Tudor age has long passed. There are no more yeomen guarding queens' chambers. No priests ready to judge your soul for what you do beneath covers. But the echoes remain. Because the pattern didn't die with Henry. Women endure, men misunderstand. Sex becomes negotiation even now for power, validation, safety. The horror simply changed costumes. We don't call it marital duty anymore, but how many still feel backed into obligation? We don't burn witches at the stake, but how many women still set themselves on fire just to keep peace? We don't chop off queens' heads, but how many lose themselves piece by piece to loneliness, perfectionism, or emotional violence? So tonight, as you climb into your bed alone, or next to someone, pause for a moment. Let your mind dim the lights of history. Think of Catherine Howard, barely 21, practicing how to lay her neck on the block so she wouldn't tremble before the blade. Think of Jane Seymour, exhausted, holding her newborn son but too weak to reach the next sunrise. Think of Catherine Parr, writing by candlelight while warily listening for the footsteps of men who might want her dead. Think of the countless unnamed women in London alleys, in farm cottages, on ships, in castles who died because they were born into a body that someone else believed he owned. And then, take one deep breath, whisper gently, "We will live differently. Tonight, choose to love in freedom. Tonight, believe that your desire is not a sin, that your body is not an asset, that intimacy is not a trap. That history may be filled with tragedies, but we do not have to repeat them. Make tenderness a revolution. Make consent a love language. Let today's bedroom be a sanctuary, not a silent battlefield. Close your eyes, warm beneath a blanket untouched by fear. You are not a queen trying to please a tyrant. You are not a bargaining chip between kingdoms. You are not a vessel for heirs or a prop for someone's pride. You are simply human. And if you listen closely, in the hush between breaths, perhaps you'll hear them, all those Tudor women who came before you, leaning through the centuries, whispering the one blessing they never received. Sleep safe. Love freely. Wake in your own body, not as someone's property, but as someone's self. Good night, traveller of the present. When you wake tomorrow, let the brokenness of the past be not your inheritance but your compass.